Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Private Equity 360. And I'm really excited about this one. This is going to cover an interesting topic, and that's the evolving trends of how institutional investors are diligencing private equity firms. And we've got this a pretty interesting subject because I know it's an evolving landscape here. It includes a lot of different issues, which we're going to talk about today. We've got two great experts here today that I'm going to have them introduce themselves. Neal, I know you're the Director of Standards and Best Practices at ILPA, the Institutional Limited Partners Association. Could you introduce yourself first? And Sabrina will go to you, and then we'll just jump right in. So Neal, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much, Bob. And it's a pleasure to be here and thrilled to be able to talk about this topic that is near and dear to me, as it's part of a big project that we're currently undertaking here at ILPA. So as Bob mentioned, my name is Neal Prunier. I am the Director of Standards and Best Practices. And as that title suggests, I focus on the variety of standards and best practices that we here at ILPA currently have out in the industry, as well as looking for opportunities to introduce new and refresh standards and best practices.
That's awesome. And we're going to go back. I'm going to go back to you after Sabrina introduces herself to talk a little bit about ILPA itself.
Yeah.
Because I think our viewers, many of them are aware, but it's such a great organization, and we've loved our relationship with ILPA. Sabrina, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Here at FD, I lead the process risk and governance practice, which is our advisory practice. We cover internal audit, Sarbanes-Oxley, IT audit, cybersecurity, and basically risk and controls. And so our team is focused on either designing and implementing best practices or testing and reporting on those best practices and the implementation of those.
And Sabrina and I are in the same organization. In fact, she sits right down the hall from me as we're recording this. So obviously risk and controls, SOC reports will be part of this conversation for sure, because we know that's an evolving requirement by some institutional LPs. But Neal, I'm going to go back to you for a second. Let's talk about the Institutional Limited Partners Association that everybody calls ILPA. And if you could, we could take a step back and talk about, what the goals of this organization. You're representing the interest of institutional investors. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit, then we could go into your project of the DDQ and get into it. So talk about ILPA for a second, if you will.
Sure thing. Happy to. So when you think about ILPA, we're the only global organization that's fully dedicated to advancing the interests of LPs and their beneficiaries. And we do this through three different means. One is events, two is education, and three is advocacy and standards. And we like to say we as ILPA for LPs by LPs. And that's really at the heart of how we operate. We have over 500 institutional members representing over $2 trillion in private equity AUM. And we think this is about 50% of the global institutional PE AUM. So our members make up a really big piece of the equation. Historically, at ILPA, we've been thought of as a public pension organization, but in reality, we've seen our membership expand significantly over the last 5 or 10 years, with public pensions now only serving as about a quarter of our membership, with the rest comprised of family offices, insurance, sovereign wealth funds, private pensions, and endowments and foundations. Our membership is 60% US based and 40% comprised of Europe, Canada, Asia, the Middle East, and the rest of the world. So before I mention the three different ways that we help contribute to our LPs, events, education, advocacy, and standards, we've been so thrilled to have Bob and FD participate in some of our events in the past. We have a number of different major conferences that we put on each year. We do a US summit, and we've recently done a European summit. This past year was the second year we've done that. We have our marquee event, our members conference, coming up here in a few weeks at the beginning of June. And then our legal conference, which is the newest conference to the table. Additionally, we've recently introduced roundtables, which is another way for us to get together with our members and other groups to push forward ideas and have in-depth conversations. So for example, just last week, we convened a roundtable with over 200 participants across LPs, GPs, consultants, and service providers that are part of our diversity and action initiative. And we're able to have some really in-depth conversations via breakout groups. And you can only imagine the work that goes into breakout groups with 200 plus participants. We also do education, which is primarily through our ILPA Institute, which can be done in person, virtual, or we now are offering an online portal. And these courses range from 101 level to specialize in particular topics such as ODD or IDD or private credit. And then finally, advocacy and standards. And at the heart of the work here, and really at the heart of the work that ILPA does, are the three themes of transparency, alignment of interest, and governance. All of the standards we put together, all the best practices we create, really are seeking to enhance these elements within the industry to promote greater transparency between LPs and GPs, create stronger alignment of interest, and overall enhance the governance that exists in the industry.
FD and FD Fund Administration, we've been involved with you guys, I think for almost 4 years now, been part of your annual summit, your emerging manager initiative, which has been fantastic. And it's just been great to see how you interact with your LPs and get information from them. Really great to hear about the roundtables, because we're going to talk about how do you synthesize these needs, these evolving needs that end up in guidance, right? Like the DDQ. And I'm going to turn to Sabrina a little bit, because we've kind of seen it from the other end, where we've had private equity firms come to us and say, hey, we know that we're going to be asked for a SOC report pretty soon, right? It's coming. So Sabrina's group provides SOC readiness and those type of things. But Sabrina, I want to touch on cybersecurity and the standards that you attest to or assess. When you talk about data and data privacy, Neal, I know that's going to be part of your DDQ. But Sabrina, could you talk a little bit about just the landscape in cybersecurity and what's happening, not only just for private equity firms, for any firm, and the work that you do?
Well, specifically with cyber, and I'd like to take a step back and say I really enjoy working with Neal, because I'm considered a compliance enthusiast. And the reason that is because I see over the last several decades, not to date myself, but the value of understanding what being in compliance or having good standards and practices in place, what that does for an organization. And I've battled, even though I carry the title of auditor, I've battled over the years the challenge of being seen as an auditor instead of as an advisor. And what we like to do is really work with organizations that have to align with a certain framework or certain requirements, and help them to meet those, not because they have to, but because it's the right thing to do. But even taking it a step further, in that it's a differentiator, it can be something that can be marketed, it can be something that can be promoted. And when we're talking about sales, marketing, increasing the value of an organization to prepare for a sale, there's nothing better than to be able to point to the governance that has been put in place, to talk about the processes and the procedures that have been put in place to protect not just the organization, but the stakeholders. And so when we talk about cyber, that seems to be top of mind. I like to say that since the Sony breach, cybersecurity and cyber breaches have become a household word, household name. People understand the threats that are out there. As more and more of these breaches begin to impact us, you look at the most recent, where the Southeast were in line for gas because of ransomware attack. When it starts to impact us personally, when it goes beyond Angelina Jolie's emails and to where someone's life is actually being impacted, think about the Dallas and Texas this winter, not necessarily cyber, but the management of processes and procedures and how they can impact individuals is becoming a much more greater part of the landscape, and the valuation and trust, whether
Well,
people trust the organization.
and that's an interesting segue, because if you think about, and Neal, you and I talked about this in our prep session, all the data that LPs and GPs, private equity firms have and are sharing, it's interesting. And I want your viewpoint on this, Neal, but it seems like, the legacy of diligencing private equity firms has been about their performance, how the investment performance. And now it looks like it's really more and more attention is being paid to the back office. Like, how are you handling data? Is it secure? Are you using a third-party administrator? If not, why not? Neal, could you kind of comment on that a little bit? Kind of paint the picture of where we've been and where we're going.
Sure, and that's spot on, Bob. Is operational due diligence has become even more of an important element of the process, even to the extent where if you're looking at a manager that you perhaps haven't worked before, at times there's going to be members and LPs and consultants and OCIOs that are going to first do ODD. And if you don't pass basic parameters of the ODD, you don't move on to the investment due diligence stage, because it's the foundation. If you think about the house, you want to have a very solid foundation. If you have fancy shower features and sound system throughout the house, that's great. But if you don't have the foundation there, that's not going to last, and that's going to cause problems because your processes aren't repeatable, they're not controlled, there's likelihood for risks, there's likelihood for errors, there's likelihood for things to go wrong. So ODD has only become more important as part of the process, looking at the controls, the procedures that are in place at the home of the GP. As you mentioned, we are looking more in, as part of our updated DDQ, want to do more about, are you insourcing, are you outsourcing? If you are outsourcing, what type of controls are at place with those vendors? What certifications, what credentials, what accreditations do they have to make sure that the data is getting protected? What are your own individual at the GP level cybersecurity policies? How are you protecting your own organization, your portfolio companies, the member, the LP, the client data? What are the various elements that you got set up to make sure that everything is in good hands?
Yeah, it's interesting because, and I'm going to turn to Sabrina on this, but we have, as a leading fund administrator, I think some of our private equity firm clients have been able to this date help check that box a little bit. We're using a third-party administrator. Here's their SOC report, and that helps. But are you seeing, and Sabrina can comment on this, are you seeing a trend toward not only using a third-party administrator, but also the organization itself having a SOC report? And maybe, I'll tell you, let me go to Sabrina on this about what is a SOC report. And then maybe, Neal, you could comment on, are you seeing it going that direction? Which I think it might be going there. But Sabrina, talk about what a SOC report is.
Sure. A SOC report, for those of us with grays, remember them as SAS 70s. That is a product out of the AICPA, which is a service organization control report. It's an examination around a service organization's offerings and how they deliver them, how they secure the information, how they manage the transactions. There's a number of different ways that an organization's control activities can be tested. And what a SOC examination does is it provides an independent third-party attestation report from a CPA firm that demonstrates those controls have been tested for either design and or operating effectiveness over time. So understanding what that document does, and I referred to it as a product because while it may be a voluntary examination that someone goes through, or it may be required, which is probably about 90% of the SOC reports that we perform, they are required by another body. But what that does is it does two things. It tells your external users what policies, processes, and procedures that you have in place that are operating effectively. but it also tells you internally, and that may be executive management, it may be investors. It tells them what is being evaluated and what is working and potentially what is not. What it doesn't tell you is what is not covered. And that's where a lot of organizations have to expand that view to not just be what is being reported externally, but what are we carving outside of the scope of this examination that we possibly have to evaluate for risk internally? And those questions may be asked by external parties.
That's a good segue. Thank you, Sabrina, because, Neal, I'm going to kind of turn to you on the roundtables and how you get feedback and how this is, and I think your updated DDQ guidance is coming out next month in June. But could you talk about what you're hearing from the LPs and how it's influencing your guidance, Neal, on that? It doesn't have to necessarily be controls, but as it relates to the back office.
Sure, happy to. So just to set the stage, when we think about our DDQ, it was first released in 2013, subsequently updated in 2016 and 2018 to cover ESG and DEI, respectively.
Yeah.
So it has had a couple updates, but they've been really focused on important topics, but not on the overall PE landscape. So you can imagine the types of developments that have come up since 2013 in the private equity space that our DDQ is not fully capturing right now. So we have an ongoing conversation with our members to really understand what are the elements that are missing, what are you using of our materials, what are you not, and if you're not using it, are you putting together your own supplement? What are the types of questions that you're asking to fully meet your needs? So when we think about development since 2013, co-investments, sublines, cybersecurity, succession planning, and different elements related to fund terms that have become more in question, such as, for example, continuation funds. So there's a number of different topics that we know we want to target on to better address and make sure from the beginning there's greater transparency, greater awareness in order to support that alignment of interest and governance. So we have these conversations to do it a little bit more pragmatically. We do have a program that we call our LP Insights, where members of our team conduct over 200 calls a year with our members and various individuals within the organizations. And we do this to get a sense of what's keeping you up at night, what are the biggest issues you're facing, what are the biggest challenges you're facing, how can the ILPA better support you? And that helps highlight ideas and bring it to the forefront. We then have a number of different committees with some of the smartest people in the industry taking part of it. We've got our Reporting Standards Advisory Committee, our Legal Advisory Committee, Industry Affairs, Content, Governance, and our board as well. And we have in-depth conversations with them on a regular basis about what are new issues that you're seeing, what's coming up. So we really do try to get the pulse of our members' thoughts about the industry on a regular basis. When we have events in person, that's another great way. That's why we've done roundtables to be able to help supplement that. And that's why we've done a number of other one-offs with members to try to supplement some of those conversations. But it's really important for us to understand what they're seeing and what's missing. For example, with the DDQ, realistically, it's never going to cover 100% of our LPs' needs because of specific questions that are important to your board, your investment committee, your state regulators, whatever it may be. There's going to be some questions that are unique that you're going to ask. My goal with our DDQ, for example, is to try to hit about 80 to 85% of the questions that our members are going to ask and standardize that further to help streamline the data flow between GPs and LPs, recognizing then that the remaining 15, 20% probably is going to have to be unique, ad hoc, customized. But the more we can limit that and reduce that, the smoother the process will be to share information.
Yeah, and we work with so many GPs that are raising Fund 5, Fund 6, emerging managers, as you know. It just seems like obvious to go to your guidance on the DDQ and say, this is what I'm going to, especially if you're going for institutional money, or even like you mentioned, family office, which we've seen got very active, right, in the space. It just seems that they ought to be checking down that your DDQ and getting ready, whether it's going through a SOC readiness themselves, looking at a third-party administrator to help mitigate that operational risk they have in their back office. it sounds like, Neal, what you're doing is so comprehensive in terms of getting that feedback. I just think it's a great service you offer your members. I know we're getting close to the end of our time. I just kind of want to go around the table and just, I know we've been talking about trends and where this thing might be going. Sabrina, I know that you and your team have been working not only with portfolio companies, but with private equity firms themselves to get ready for this. And I know you mentioned third parties are usually requiring this. I can definitely see the institutional LPs, they're not going to require it necessarily, but maybe they're leaning more toward that, Neal, right? I mean, that this is so evolving. Like we've seen the trend in third party administration use really tick up year after year after year because of governance and transparency and risk mitigation.
The concept of the SOC report, an independent evaluation of a service organization's offering. I believe that Neal would agree that the uptick in use of these third-party administrators is let the experts be the experts. What I do warn individuals, though, is you may be mitigating risk by outsourcing certain transactions or certain functions, but you cannot outsource risk, meaning if the organization that you are using has an issue, that still belongs to you. You still own that issue as far as your stakeholders are concerned. So it's very important, just as an organization is being evaluated for its controls and its governance posture, we need to, as users of TPAs, also take that same responsibility and evaluate their environment to minimize the risk of something happening as a result of using their services.
That's an excellent point. Neal?
Yeah. And no, I mean, that's exactly right. And this isn't necessarily just unique to GPs. If you think about any business, you have to decide what component of the business process are you going to play in and what are you going to outsource? What are you going to move to others? So, for example, you don't typically see a company that is responsible for cutting down the trees all the way through producing the paper to getting it to your front door. There's other businesses that come in and specialize in certain segments. That exists throughout the entire business community. So for GPs, the question is, are you or can you be best in class at this segment of the responsibility set? If not, why are you trying to do it yourself? If so, great, showcase, prove it. And if not, okay, that should probably be outsourced then. That's the VRIO analysis. You should be outsourcing that. Yeah. Who you select to outsource then becomes a very important question. Are you outsourcing to the top tiers that have the best processes in place? Are you outsourcing to the lowest cost, lowest level deliverable to save costs, reduce fees, whatever it may be? So these are the types of questions that are very important and are only going to become more important, particularly because I think many GPs are looking at it and saying, we can be best in class in our investment decisions and are working with portfolio companies to help them strengthen their operations and performance in identifying opportunities. We can't be best in class in administration services. And those are two different skill sets. And it's not a bad thing if you're not best in class in one, but to be able to identify that, self-actualize and say, we should be outsourcing this, that's a huge step. And that's something I think a lot of LPs are looking for to make sure that's done right. I'm going to steal this from one of our members. They like to say, institutional investors require institutional data. And that comes up when GPs come to us and say, well, we're just getting started in this space. Do we really need to do your templates? This is a lot. It takes us some time. Well, if you want institutional clients, this is the institutional level of data that they are requiring and looking for. So at the end of the day, yes. And that then relates to the vendors, service providers that you're using and the controls that they have in place as well.
That's excellent. And it reminds me that, and we've been honored to be part of your emerging manager toolkit on your website, where we've given guidance. And in my talk on that video, it's about exactly that. I mean, if you have institutional investors in your future, go first class all the way. in terms of who your law firm is, your auditors, your third-party administrator, your investor portals, how you communicate. Even if you're, just coming out of the gate with your first fund, if you have plans to go further, just get it right on the front end. I mean, it's just something not to mess around with. Well, this has been great, guys. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I did want to mention one other thing, that Sabrina also hosts a podcast series at FD called Culture of Compliance. Sabrina, I'll make sure that at the end of this one, we'll reference that in case you want to have this content go into your podcast series, which I think would be great. Neal, I just want to thank you for coming, and just want to encourage all of our viewers to really look at ILPA. I mean, what a fantastic organization. It's really one of the finest organizations we've ever been associated with. So helpful, very strategic. Just what you do for your members and the guidance and resources you provide are just fantastic. And we look forward to being involved with you for years to come. So any other final comments before we go around the table? Are we good? I really enjoyed this. Sabrina, any final comments from you?
Thank you for being invited. This is great. And it was great to have this conversation with Neal. We obviously work towards the same goals.
Absolutely. Neal, any final comment from you?
Yeah, the one other thing that I'd add, and I mentioned before the idea of roundtables and all the conversations that we have with LPs, there is another piece of the equation, and we'd be ignorant to say we only talk to LPs before we put something out into the industry.
Yeah.
We do have a number of conversations with GPs. We have a number of conversations with subject matter experts. We have another number of conversations with other third parties that are involved in that particular element. So before we started recording, I mentioned to Sabrina, I'm going to be reaching out to you about some cybersecurity questions when we think about our due diligence questionnaire, because
Awesome.
we want to make sure what we're putting out is relevant and is going to be worthwhile for the entire industry. We are ILPA, we're for LPs by LPs, but if we put something out that doesn't have GP buy-in, doesn't have GP feedback, as well as the other interconnected parties, the success and the adoption of those materials aren't going to be what we would want it to be. So that really is an important element for us to try to get a full 360-degree review of the materials, both in the lead up to a release and during a comment period, so that the materials that we're putting out there can be really well reviewed and get the adoption level that we would want to see.
Well, thank you for mentioning PE 360. I like that little drop in. Neal, one last thing before I let you guys go. When are you expecting to release your guidance on the DDQ? You had mentioned maybe June. Is that?
Yep. So we're going to be releasing it to public comment period the week of June 28th. So the end of June, and we're going to be running a comment period through about mid-August. Okay. So about a 6-7 week comment period, with the idea of then being able to release it in full to the market in early to mid-September. This will include the DDQ. It's also going to include some new work that we're doing as part of the Diversity and Action Initiative, to enhance our DE&I element of the DDQ, as well as the ILPA diversity template. So there's been a lot of great work going on in that space, and it's all going to be part of the overarching DDQ, both public comment period and then release come September.
Well, we'll look forward to that, and we'll make sure that we'll socialize that aggressively once it's out. Thank you so much for this time. We may follow up, do this again, maybe toward the end of the year, and see how the trends are evolving. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to one of Frazier and Dieter's branded podcasts. To learn more, connect with us on LinkedIn or visit us at FrazierDieter.com, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode.